You're my best Boy Scout.
Okay.
There we go. Welcome everybody to our North Ogden City Council work session this evening. We'll begin our meeting by an invocation and a pledge of allegiance by Blake Sebring, council member.
Heavenly Father, we gather before Thee tonight, and we're thankful for the incredible circumstances that we meet under. We're thankful for the blessings that we have been given. Grateful to live in this beautiful community and for the beautiful mountains that surround us. We pray that as we have met this night, that the decisions rendered would be for the best benefit of the citizens and for the city. We pray for those who lead us in so many different varieties of political positions, and pray for their strength and pray for their wisdom. And we seek this, thy guidance in all that we do, and we pray for this in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
Amen.
So repeat after me.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. Our first item on the agenda this evening is the major projects update. The presenter will be John Call, our city administrator and attorney.
So, council, this is something that we've talked about starting with the council on our monthly work sessions, or when we have our work sessions. The idea being that any of the projects that there's currently being money spent for, where the project would exceed $500,000, we're going to talk about it with the council, so any questions and updates can be addressed as the council sees them. The first one on the list is the Monroe Boulevard expansion. For those council members who are new, this has been an ongoing project for the past 2 or 3 years. We got what's called corridor preservation funds from WACOG. To the way the way corridor preservation funds are designed is, if you identify where a road is going to go, then you can buy the ground now with the understanding that the improvements for the road would be done at some later date. And so we're actually buying the last property where from a sorry, let me stop one other thing. The other thing that's stipulated to those funds is you can't use eminent domain for them unless the project is happening in the next 3 or 4 years. And so with Monroe, where the actual construction timeline for that project is expected to be 10 years out or further, depending on which section of the road you're talking about, we haven't used any eminent domain, and we've purchased roughly 85% of the length of the property, with about 90 to 95% of the property owners actually selling their property. So most of the reason that works is because it's kind of through agricultural areas or other areas that are undeveloped. The way the roadway was designed was to not require the tearing down of any roads or any homes or things like that. The only let me just pull up a map so I can help you see the alignment for this project, if the browser will work. So it's actually, there are some sections of Monroe that have already gone in. This is a section of Monroe Boulevard right here that will then continue down through this area and then tie in down here. This is Green Acres Park, or Orton Park, where Monroe is currently stubbed at the south end of the city. And then as you go north in the city limits, there's some other sections that are done. This is where the Campbell's property is. The little Campbell barn is right here on 2600. There's a section of Monroe done here. There's another section widened here between 2750 and 2850. And then once you get up above 3100, Monroe is in right here by Bates all the way up until it connects in the existing cove to what's called, or Mountain Road. We'll go to that point. So Monroe is essentially a north-south connection between 1700 North and Mountain Road. And even from 1700 North, the idea is it would connect to the Monroe in Ogden as well. So like I said, the majority of that right-of-way, I mean, there's a large section, obviously, from here to here that's already been given to the city by developers as the projects have happened. That's in large part because it's been on our transportation map for so long, as well as the other sections here and here where it's been planned. We've bought right-of-way in this area, here, and here. Well, this is the last piece we're buying. It's here in the next, we should close on it in the next couple of weeks. And
Are
then
they still planning on moving the barn, or what's the?
Yeah, so under the agreement for that, we're gonna move the barn to Barker Park as part of the improvements over there, and if we don't use it over there, then the family gets it back. So that's the way the agreement's been written. We don't have any plans to move it tomorrow. In fact, we've told them we'll give them 6 months' notice before it gets moved, because right now, the family members live in that red brick house right there by it, and they still use it for storage for things, between the various family members. I think they kind of have little sections in the barn.
Okay.
But anyways, the biggest piece of property we haven't purchased is this piece. This property owner just wasn't interested in selling to the city, as well as there's another piece of property right across the street that they just weren't interested. So there's a couple pieces we don't own. At some point we might need to buy them, but for now, the way the WACOG funds are set, if they don't want to sell, they don't have to. So that's where that project is.
So John, just a quick question, that road is designed to be how wide? Because Monroe in Ogden is quite a bit wider.
So when it gets into North Ogden, it's supposed to narrow down to 3 lanes. Right now it's 5 in Ogden.
Yeah.
So it'd be a 3-lane road, which is a center lane with 2 traffic. On our books, that's an 80-foot wide road. Understanding that sidewalk to sidewalk, not asphalt. So the asphalt cross-section, I think, is 50 some odd feet wide. Kind of similar to what the north part of Washington as it heads up the hill is.
Okay.
It's a 5-lane road, or a 3-lane road. The next project is the 3100 debris basin. We've talked about that recently in a few council meetings. That's the basin that will go right here from this is commonly called Slide Canyon. So this is where that debris slide came out of the hill in the early 90s that Mayor Chug was involved in a lot of the cleanup work because he lives in that area and was the state president at the time. The idea will be that basin is going in. The landowner who owns this piece of ground here is paying the matching portion, or reimbursing the city the matching portion, as well as and then the feds are paying the other roughly 75% of it. So there's about $290,000 that the landowner's paying, and about $850,000 that the neighboring landowner, or the landowner will be, or that the feds will be paying. So that should be done at little to no cost to the city. Obviously, the benefit to the landowner is that they'll be able to put some houses in this area. That's their ultimate goal. They have that being an application before the planning commission. It should be heard in the next couple of weeks, just to do kind of a preliminary. And the council, as you know, we approved the contract for the engineer to design the basin about 2 months ago, and then the reimbursement agreement with the landowner a couple of weeks ago. We have got our first bill from the engineer for their design work and environmental work, and they are, and then the landowner is wiring us the money before the bill's even due, which is that's the way our agreement works. So the city doesn't actually have to float that money. It just, we get it from him and then we pay it. So, any questions about that one? The other one that's on here, or there's another street projects. This is kind of our generic street projects. Every year across the city, we do maintenance, resurfacing, restriping, recoating type of projects. It typically exceeds $500,000 a year. The majority of that comes from what's called B&C road funds, which are state funds that come into the city that have to be used on roads. We also have the Transportation Utility Fund that folks pay every year, as part of our every month, we pay $3. That money is also used for these type of maintenance projects, as well as some of these expansion projects when they come down the pipeline. But that's, last year I think we spent $750,000 on road projects, these kind of maintenance projects, and this year I think we're right at about $500,000. But that's going to be an ongoing expenditure. That B&C money typically comes from UDOT through the transportation tax that's part of gasoline purchases that goes to the state. So the B roads are county roads, the C roads are, or wait, no, it's opposite. The B roads are city roads and the C roads are county roads. So they just call it B&C road funds. The next one is a water storage facility. So as the city grows, we need additional water storage. The way the state rule is set up is the city should have 400 gallons of culinary water in storage at all times for every resident, so that if there's a catastrophe, then there's water on hand to get us through 24 to 48 hours of culinary water for folks.
You said for every resident, you mean every household?
Every home, yeah. So, or living dwelling units. So the apartments need a certain amount as well. This is an expansion so that we stay within the limits of that per the state standards. Right now, we have a basin down here by a facility down here at Wadman Park. The thought is to expand a tank off to the east side of that. There are some other locations that are being considered for that expansion as well. But in large part, the expansion, the higher up the hill it goes, the more benefit it is to the city. Because if we do it higher up the hill, it can serve more of the pressure zones. Or for example, if we built one all the way up at the top of the cove, we could get water to any home in the city without pumping it. The lower we put it, then the harder it is to get it to the upper parts of the city because we have to pump, and if we didn't have electricity, then it's harder to pump water around. But this is the area that they're looking at as the most likely location for a tank. So the way this project is planned is a portion of it is being budgeted for, or the council's already budgeted for with the most recent budget to do the design and the beginning of the construction at the beginning of next summer, with the understanding that the last half of the project would be built in the next fiscal year, and so then it would be kind of budgeted across 2 budget years. To fund this project, one of the things that we've talked about was selling the old Public Works facility, which is technically a water asset, meaning that the water group paid for the property or bought it for the city. So when that property is sold, it should go back to water projects. And so the idea is if we sell that property, then we can fund that money into other asset type infrastructure. Any questions about that one? The one thing that'll probably be a little unique about this project is they're looking at building a rectangular tank so that we don't eliminate this walking path that goes around this area. as well as the ability to expand that facility. What you do is you just build another rectangular tank off to the side and drill a couple holes in the wall, and you can expand the tank. Whereas the circular tanks that most people traditionally build are a little harder to expand. Well, impossible to expand is probably the better word, because it's hard to, you can't tie them together. So they're looking into the feasibility of that type of a design. The amphitheater, this is the one the council, if you remember during the budget session, there was a recommendation to take amphitheater expenditures out of the current budget until more clarity on exactly what type of improvements we're talking about. So the park staff and the designers of the facility are putting together a list and estimated cost so that to present to the council. And the goal is to kind of look at finishing the inside of the building, getting lights and fire sprinklers and things like that put together. But we're going to bring back a future project list, or kind of a shopping cart that the council can kind of decide what is the highest priority if the council wants to do that this year. So, any questions about that? Okay. The last three projects, the 2550 detention basin, this one is with the council. We're looking still at whether we're buying the property for the new location, as well as what type of facility will be put there. I can answer any other questions if you have anything in your minds, but that's more just where we are, and I think you've been involved in that quite a bunch lately, so I imagine it's right on the cusp of your minds. The 400 East widening project. This is one that's been talked about, but not a lot recently, other than updates on, we've purchased a few homes over here by the Wells Fargo building and the Fizz building. Let me just pull up this little map. So, because we're affecting this intersection, it's all getting rolled into the same project. This 2600 widening is the same as the intersection widening, because in order to get enough travel lanes moving in the different directions, we have to expand the roadway essentially up here to 475 East, which is the road that's just on the west side of the library. And the second lane that's headed to the east will essentially become a dedicated right-hand turn lane here behind the library. So people will either have to merge into the left lane or take a right and go around behind the library. There aren't any plans currently to go beyond the limit of that as far as any fund approved or grants received or anything like that. That's the limit of this project. And it is anticipated that the widening will be on the south side of the road. That's why we bought those houses where the rental homes that were there, as well as we're talking about buying we're in negotiations on the Wells Fargo building, as well as the strip in front of the Fizz building. It's anticipated that the road is going to be somewhere around 90 feet wide as you get further to the west or to the east. At the intersection, it'll most likely be wider than that, which is why the Wells Fargo needs to come down, or at least all the parking will be eaten up in front of the Wells Fargo, and then it'll narrow as it heads to the east, eventually turning back into the 2-lane road that's out here. So that's going out for environmental RFP, meaning they're hiring an engineer to do the environmental analysis, which includes everything from the natural environment to the built environment. If you've never seen one of those type of environmental analyses done, they look at every possible effect that the project's going to have on the residents, the animals, all that kind of stuff. So that's where we're at on that project. The other kind of highlight to that project is up at 2850 in Alberta, we're hoping to realign that intersection and put in a stoplight so that people aren't making that kind of dangerous left-hand turn movement at an offset intersection that happens there on a daily basis. One of the most important things about this project is it's about a $10.5 million project, and about an 8.5 of that is coming from other funding sources. The majority of which is coming from the WFRC, which is money that there again kind of gets routed through UDOT, through the state taxes and things like that. But there's also quite a bit of money coming from WACOG, which is our local, it's the Weber Area Coalition of Governments. All the cities and towns have a mayor who sits on that board, and they think of ways to spend the local transportation sales tax that's part of what we pay in Weber County. And so part of that money is coming back to us for this project as well. There's two ways that that's being spent. One is that we talked about the corridor preservation funds, as well as some construction money. The difference in this one is with these corridor preservation funds, because the project is much more imminent or pending, we are actually authorized to use condemnation and for that money. So far we haven't. We've bought 10 homes on this alignment. 2 of them were torn down, the other 8 are still up. But they'll be torn down when the road widening gets to that part of the alignment. So we still have a bunch of front yards to buy along as you head between the cherry on the top salon is that building up to 2850. There'll be some homes some front yards to buy. We're hoping for a design that'll be narrow enough that we don't have to buy any more homes from people and tear anything else down. Their front yards are deep enough that the current alignment that's being proposed, which is about a 96-foot alignment or right-of-way width, should still stay close to 30 feet away from the front doors of every house or from the building of every house. So, which is our normal setback, which typically would not require a condemnation to occur or a full tear down of the building. So, but that'll be something the council will make the ultimate decision on, the exact right-of-way and the exact alignment, and that'll happen after the environmental study has been done. They'll kind of bring back some recommendations for the council to consider.
So John, that shows 2020. Is that when construction is anticipated to begin?
Yes,
Okay.
that's when UDOT has it on their schedule to start the intersection.
That's
And
moved a little bit because it was going to be 2019. So it's moved.
it was originally going to be 2018, and then the timing with UDOT and some other things pushed it back, and so it just ended up being that with the timing, it's more cost efficient to bid projects in the fall, especially road projects, because the companies are planning their next summers of activities. And so by being in that bidding time, we're anticipating that UDOT and us together to do all legs of the project will be able to get a good deal and run the whole project through one contractor. So like the intersection's only shut down once, and shut down I mean restricted. I don't think it'll ever be completely shut down for a 24-hour period, but it'll be, one project as opposed to 3 different projects that would nip the intersection various times throughout the coming years. So that's the way it's being proposed right now.
John, won't they start designing it next year, 2019?
So they'll start doing the environmental. We'll do what's called a 30% design, which is essentially they'll establish some road widths and things like that, but they won't do all the underground utility analysis and all that. That's the last half of the design. So they'll do the environmental and the 30% design, and then once it's greenlit, assuming it passes off through environmental, then there'll be a second RFP that's sent out to hire an actual engineering design firm to do the rest of the work. And then when the design documents are done in the fall of 2019, then we'll go out to bid for a contractor. That's the schedule right now. And then the last thing is just kind of a catch-all, just some updates on future things for the council to think in their mind. There aren't any current plans or money expended or planned to be expended on these type of projects, other than normal stuff that comes up every year, particularly like the park rehab projects. Those type of things come up every year with new sprinkler timers or things like that. But there is eventually gonna be a need for a new police station at some point in the future. Our current building is 50 years old than that. And there's just some real problems with it. It doesn't have a lot of light in it. It doesn't, some of the utilities are not functioning as good as they should be. And our personnel is just outgrowing it in a lot of respects. If you actually look at the building, it's already been expanded once. There's an addition to the east that, you know, wasn't originally part of it. So it's not something that has to be done, but it's just, you know, something to keep in mind. Barker Park is another one that the council's been talking around about a lot lately. So that's just more park improvements. There are also other street widenings projected at some point in the future based on the transportation plan. The biggest ones to think about are the Mountain Road corridor. The idea is that Mountain Road would go from the south end of the city up, around, and connect into, let me just go to the map because that's easier. But it should connect into Pleasant View City on what they call Skyland Drive. So it'd come down, is this on? Yeah. So it'd come down and loop around the city and connect up to here. And there are some sections built. This is a section of that road that's constructed. There's some more down here in Mason Cove. There's a section right here. And so as developers come in this area of the city, they'll be putting in the road widening. And then down here on Mountain Road, that'll most likely be the last portion that's widened, because that's going to be pretty much done on the city's nickel. And then the other one to mention, obviously the Monroe would eventually be widened or built out at some point, as well as there is the current plan, let me scroll down a little bit, is to, as it's currently written, is 2600 would be widened to 5 lanes all the way to 1050 East is the current plan for that property. That there again, it hasn't been approved or no money's being spent on it. But those are kind of things that are coming in the future, though, you know, not in the next 4 or 5 years at least, I would imagine, because there's no grant money available, and those type of projects typically require grant money. Any questions about future projects, or is there anything I've left off here that you'd like me to update council on in the coming months? I've just bored you all to tears, and I'm sorry.
It was riveting, John.
Okay. Well, if you do have questions, you can shoot me an email, let me know, and I'll add it to the list of things to update. We can do it. The idea is if we do it at every work session, then it'll be quicker, because we can say this is what's changed from last time, and then as well as hit any highlights or questions that people have, you know, the council's had. So, okay.
Thank you, John. Next item on the agenda is a discussion on form-based code. That'll be presented by Brandon Bell, our associate planner.
Good evening, Mayor and members of the council. I have a presentation for you. It's an overview on the form-based code. And the purpose of this presentation is essentially to help you, in your mind, be able to understand the type of development that the form-based code is intended to produce. And then also, as you read through the code, to understand the principles that enable the creation of that type of development. So we're trying to marry those two ideas, and so I'm trying to give you the big picture tonight so that you can have the opportunity to review the code and understand the purpose of the detail in the code and what the principles, the end result that the principles are intended to accomplish. So there's, just as some background, there's 2 common types of development that are referred to in various planning movements in urban planning. And one is drivable suburban and one's walkable urban. These are both type of development patterns that you have experienced and that you're familiar with. You may not recognize the name, but you've experienced both. And it's important to note that the purpose of the form-based code is to produce one specific type of these two, and that's walkable urban. The reason why that's important to note is because there are policies and ideas that don't mix well entirely with the form-based code because it has that specific goal in mind. And so our goal as staff is to help you make an informed decision about which path that you'd like to pursue. The point being that just like if you were to try to change certain ingredients in one recipe, it wouldn't work out so well. If you try and change certain ingredients in the recipe for walkable urban development, it also wouldn't work out so well. And so it's not a value judgment between drivable suburban or walkable urban. It's just saying this is what it's intended to produce. There are certain choices that are compatible with the code, and there's certain choices that aren't very compatible with the code. And so sometimes the decision needs to be stepped back and decide, is this the overall path that we want to take, and do so by adopting the code, or is this not something that we're interested in? If you start to toy with certain aspects of it, you actually undercut the goal that it's trying to achieve. And so that's kind of one of the purposes of this presentation, is to help you visualize that type of development and see, is this something that I'm interested in, number one, and number two, as you read through the code, since you've seen the end result and the big picture of these that this is trying to get to, then as you read through the code, you'll understand the purpose behind the regulations and the requirements in the code. I'm going to go ahead and turn off this light so that this is more visible for myself and everyone else. And so if after reviewing, we'd like to request that you read through the code, and we'll meet in about a month and discuss details and questions that you have at that time, since you'll be more familiar with the code at that point. And then if you are interested in the big idea of the code, then we can talk about the range of policy choices that fit into the code. So pretty abstract so far. We'll get into pictures to make this more clear to you. The intent of the code is to produce walkable urban development. Another way of describing this is Main Street America and the walkable neighborhoods that support it. To bring it really close to home, you will recognize this building. This is the Cannery Center, and this is walkable urban development. This is the type of development that form-based code tends to produce, and just with updates for advances in technology and in planning, et cetera. But it's the same fundamental type of development. You'll see that this building is right next to the sidewalk. There's a storefront facade right here. There's also another storefront facade right here, some awnings. These sorts of things are common to walkable neighborhoods in Main Street America that have been produced for centuries in this country and around the world. And so one point to emphasize is that this is something you're familiar with. Everyone's experienced this at some point in their lifetime. It may not be where they live, but they've experienced a great Main Street that's a walkable Main Street with places to sit down, to shop, to eat, and feel comfortable as a pedestrian environment. The second point is that the reason for all of the detail in the code is to be able to achieve these types of environments. This is also, I think this is in Roanoke, Texas. This is a revitalized Main Street that's a walkable downtown as well. And then this gives you a little bit more detail. This picture shows kind of at a helicopter scale view. This is one block in the center here. There's 3 different types of houses on there. They're all close to the street with a generous sidewalk. They have what's an alleyway in the back that is for vehicular access. You have some townhomes over here on the next block over, some townhomes here, and different intensities of single-family homes. And so there's a mix of housing types in there, but they're done in a way that's compatible. Then the point of the detail in the code is that the reason why it gets so technical is that's the way to be effective at regulating to create this end result. So these are some photos of the type of development that we're talking about. My hope in this presentation is that you'll see more than an attractive buildings and more than attractive development by the end of this presentation, but you'll start to see the sort of principles and requirements that are creating that attractive development, the strategies and means that achieve it. And so what I'll do in this presentation is give you a list of a number of those requirements that are and principles from the code, so that you'll understand how this is created, and you'll be able to look at it and break it down into those principles. This is a walkable Main Street type of development. This is a walkable neighborhood that supports it. In other words, these are the people that live here, or the people that support these shops that go there for breakfast or dinner on Saturday evening, when they need to grab a gallon of milk on a weeknight or something like that, or they need to get a new pair of shoes. This is the place that the people in these neighborhoods typically will go. This is another example of development. This is an enlarged version of the picture you saw a moment ago. And this is 9th and 9th in Salt Lake. This is another image of 9th and 9th. So a lot of people would agree that this is an attractive development, that there's good things going on here. We're going to go through the details of what creates that development. This is not a value judgment. It's just two different ways of systems or patterns of development. This is sometimes referred to as conventional suburban development or drivable suburban development, and this is walkable urban development, or walkable Main Street, or walkable neighborhood. And so what I'd also like with these images is to hopefully, you may look at this and think, okay, Brandon, this is a really cute image. It's got some nice colors. I can see, there's some green in there. Maybe you can pick out that this is a park, but at this point in time, it may just look cute, may not have that much information. What I'm trying to do in this presentation is help you understand all of the main principles in the code that are actually being demonstrated in this diagram. It's a very information-rich diagram, and so we're going to go through those to what actually creates the difference between these two. So again, back to the diagram, these are some of the details. The first is building and parking location. The second is maximum block size, connected street network, sub-districts, building type, and open space. So all of these come together to create a complete pattern. It's one way of doing things. And so back to my comment a second ago about, it's harder it's easier to accept or reject the whole package than it is to change some things out about that. That's because it's a complete system intended to go together and end up with a result somewhat like this. And if you start messing with some of those ingredients, then it will cause a problem. Others you can vary with, but there's certain ones that are fundamental that it's easier to just say we either do want this type of environment or we don't. And so these are the core group of those ingredients, and we're going to go through those. So the first one is building and parking location. In a walkable urban development, probably at the most nuts and bolts level, a building is next to the sidewalk, which means that parking is not between the sidewalk and the building. That's really, really important. And the reason why is because I use the term walkable. This is the fundamental, I would say the fundamental essence of the principle of walkability, is that you're creating an environment that is pleasant for the pedestrian. You'll notice this point right down here. It says that the automobile is adamantly accommodated for, but is not allowed to compromise or dominate other forms of transportation, such as walking, biking, etc. So there's the two typical locations for parking would be, you can see right here, this store has basically two fronts. It's a corner store, and you can see there's parking on the street here, but it's not between the building and the sidewalk. It's either on the street or it doesn't show it here. This building could easily have parking in the back. And so those are the two typical locations for parking in this sort of development. Let's see. So buildings are next to the sidewalk, and parking is either on the street, but never between the building and the sidewalk. And so one way of looking at this issue of parking is that there's a front to the development and there's a back to the development. And it's important to make sure you know which one you're dealing with. That determines the parking location. The front is, this is, again, the front of it. You've got the buildings, and then you've got a generous sidewalk right next to it. It's a place where people can come and walk and enjoy the shops, as well as eat outside and do, this can serve as a pedestrian plaza. In fact, farther down there is a pedestrian plaza. And then this is the back. This is the parking lot. The buildings still look nice in the back, but they're set apart so that they don't mess with that pedestrian environment. This is another example in the walkable neighborhood category. Of the front is, again, there's maybe a 5 to 10 foot setback here, but the building is basically right next to the sidewalk, and the driveways are generally, the garages are generally not on the front of the homes. They're at the back of the home and are served by a residential alley. This is probably about 16 feet wide, and you have a maybe 3 or 4 foot drive into the garage. And this is another example of that. So the next point is that's fundamental to form-based code and walkable neighborhoods is a connected street network. And there's a couple of things that make this possible. This is a little technical, but it's important to cover because it's a building block of creating these types of neighborhoods. There's 3 types of streets in our code. There's what's called a primary street, a secondary street, and an internal street. A primary street, for lack of a better term, is your pretty street. This is this type of where this type of development goes. Okay, these are the types of environments that people want to drive to or walk to, and then park or just enjoy the area and stop. So we're trying to create, in the code, it's trying to create an environment that people don't want to just drive through, but they want to stop, spend their time there, and as a natural consequence of that, spend their money as well. So that we're prioritizing it's not so much prioritizing either for or against cars, but it's prioritizing for the cars that want to stop and spend time in North Ogden's downtown as opposed to someone else's downtown farther away. And so we're creating an environment that's enticing them to want to do that. So the primary streets create those pretty areas, or main streets typically. In England, you'd call it a high street. And so the key attribute of that is typically, overwhelmingly, you don't allow what's called vehicular access on this. If you break up with a drive in the middle of a block, it makes pedestrians feel a lot less comfortable, a lot less safe for them to relax and spend their time, be casual, window shop, things like this. And so the next type of street is called a secondary street. These type of streets come typically directly off of or intersect at some point with a primary street. And they're nice streets too, but they're not the focal point of the community. They're still great places to be, but this is your super high priority. This is your showpiece that you want everyone to see. This is the place that you're going to typically put on a postcard, so to speak, is your primary street. And so the secondaries, because they're not quite as high of a priority, they do allow vehicular access off of them. And so this right here would be a secondary street. You'll see that this vehicular access is this little street that I'm talking about right here. This is allowed on a secondary street. It's not allowed on this primary street. And with the internal streets, there's the main point of them is to provide vehicular access to the parking and to the buildings inside of the block. And so it's a sort of hierarchy of streets for where's your focal point, and then how do you get inside of the block, and how do you get around town. The secondaries get you around town, the primary is your main focal point, and the internals get you through and into a block. Let's see. And so I'm not going to go into too much detail on street types. These are related to the street categories. These are street types. These are not. There's 2 or 3 streets that can serve as a primary street. They all have a unique cross section, and there's 2 or 3 streets that can serve as a secondary, and there's 3 that can serve as an internal street. And so the best example I can give you is for an internal street, the most common one that you would know of that goes through a block is an alley. Another option in our code is something called a lane or an access lane, and those would an access lane would work better between 2 different parking lots. A lane would work better next to some sidewalk dining on the interior of a block. And so they have different purposes and meet different needs, but they fall in these general categories of primary, secondary, and internal streets for the purpose of vehicular access. So at this point, I want you to keep looking at this diagram and paying attention to the principles. And what I hope is that, it's going from a cute diagram with cute colors into something that's starting to give you a lot more information. You look at this, you can see these principles we've talked about of primary, secondary, internal streets, and we'll keep going and more information will come out for you. This is an example of the street, the boulevard street type, which could serve as a primary street. This is an example of a neighborhood street, which would work as a secondary street. This is a connector, also would work as a secondary street. And again, this would be another diagram shows this would be a primary street. You'll note there's no other roads coming off of it in the middle of a block. You have streets that intersect, create new blocks, but in the middle of the block, there's no streets that come off of it. Let's see. And then this is a diagram that would actually apply these principles for North Ogden in the downtown area, where we've applied designation of primary streets and secondary streets, and also like what type of street as far as like boulevard, et cetera, in some instances. If in areas where they're not, where streets are not indicated, there's still a maximum block size that would require additional streets to go into effect. We just put the streets in that we knew were critical to creating a walkable, connected street network that we discussed as one of the key principles of the, creating a walkable down Main Street and supporting neighborhoods. So maximum block size. This is another principle and requirement that you're going to come across as you read the code. Maximum block size greatly affects the walkability of a neighborhood that you develop. So for instance, our current maximum block size in North Ogden in our R1 zones is 1,320 feet. The proposed maximum, and I'll give you a little more detail on this in a second, is basically 440 by 440 or 440 by 660 in some cases for a block in the form-based code. You'll notice that's quite a large difference. What's the point of the difference? Why is it there? The point is let's say that this block right here is 440 feet. If you imagine taking that, let's say it's 1,300 is 20 feet is about 3 times as long as that block. So if there's no roads that go between all of these, and this is just a whole set of houses, and there's houses where these streets are, it dramatically reduces the ability of a person to viably walk in that area as a viable form of transportation or other non-motorized forms of transportation. And so again, this type of development is walkable urban development, and so this regulation helps create that as a reality. Let's see. Okay, the next principle and requirement that you'll notice as you review the code is the concept of subdistricts. Subdistricts, we've already kind of talked about them a little bit without telling you. Main Street is one subdistrict and the neighborhoods that support it are another. What that does is it determines essentially how urban the mix of buildings in each of these environments is. We're going to talk in a little bit about building types, but the chief variable between the downtown Main Street zone and the neighborhood zone in the code is the building types that are allowed in that zone. And so if you imagine in one of our R110 zones, if you had, say, a 4-story commercial building that most people would associate with a business park, it wouldn't necessarily fill in place, right? And so what you're doing with these subdistricts is you're creating a compatible mix of building types that will fill and work together naturally. So you're allowing different building types. And other building types is kind of, it's not saying necessarily different uses, but and I'll get more detail later, but like a townhome, townhomes can be on the same block as single family homes if they follow the same rule, okay? But you have to choose the compatible building types in order to make sure that it works, and you have to put certain regulations so that they're done in a certain way so that they are compatible. But that allows flexibility for developers, but putting the right rules in place makes sure that they play well together, so to speak, that those different building types play well together. So the 3 subdistricts in our code are downtown Main Street, downtown neighborhood, and downtown market. So let me go back a bit here. This would be the type of development you'd get in downtown Main Street, and then let's go back one more. This would be the type of development that you would get in a downtown neighborhood subdistrict, as well as show you some additional pictures. Let's see. Oh, here it is. so these townhomes could be on the opposite side of the block or the end of the block as these single-family homes. So the point is, with form-based code, is the idea is that you don't have to have all the same type of buildings on the same block. You can have a range of them as long as they have rules that make them, again, play well together. And that may be a new concept for you. If you have further questions about it, we can discuss it. Any questions you have at the end. So I've gone into this already a little bit. The way that you regulate in form-based code is not as strictly by use, but as by building type. Basically, one of the key insights of form-based code is that if you design the buildings right, put them in the right location, and have certain material requirements, that different types of uses, such as townhomes and single-family homes, or maybe a corner store has an owner that lives above on the top, on the second story, so that he only has, or he or she only has one mortgage payment, has the shortest commute in the world, etc. If you actually do these things right, then there is the ability to mix them and in a way that's beneficial and compatible. So building types are they're not exactly a replacement for regulating by use, but they're getting at the core of what a lot of people care about, which is the height of the building, the location of the building, the look of the building, and the location of the parking. And if you can address those issues, a lot of times the things that are incompatible, that you've addressed and removed the things that are incompatible that people have problems with regards to mixing building types. So let's see, again, the buildings are regulated by height, or in other words, number of stories, the location on the lot, the materials, the parking, and the parking requirements, not the density, and there's less of the restrictions on use. There are still restrictions on use, but they're not quite as restrictive. In a way you're trying to establish a relatively predictable character for a subdistrict, but also provide flexibility for a developer if there's change in the market, or there's a market that's not being met. That the city has certainty up front that they feel good that this sort of building type can go in, like some townhomes in this neighborhood, without there having to be a rezone or have an entirely separate zone. They have their certainty up front, and the developer has flexibility as the market changes in a way that doesn't put risk to the city of changing the character of the neighborhood, because it's been pre-anticipated what will fit in that and what's desired for that type of neighborhood. So to give you an example, these are some of the building types that are shown in the code. This is a storefront building. You'll notice that there are, could easily be an apartment up above for the store owner, or it could also be some professional offices. This is a general stoop building. These could easily be townhomes that people live in, or again, these could also be professional offices. And the point I'm trying to make in mentioning that is that building type, the reason why we're talking about building type is because form-based code, the word form basically means three-dimensional shape. What that's getting at is, again, people care what the look and feel of the building is, and once you get that right, there's some flexibility on the uses. You can have more flexibility on that. And so we're describing the characteristics of the buildings as opposed to the use that goes on inside of them in this terminology. That's why we're using, instead of, in our code, these would be called terrace buildings as opposed to townhomes, because they may not necessarily be townhomes. There may be a terrace building that has a little professional office on the first floor. So we're talking about the look and feel of the building, the physical characteristics of it. So we have storefront, general stoop, mid-scale shop, the terrace building, the yard building. These are your single-family homes, and then the civic building, which often is behind some civic space and open space. So again, this is something that maybe you're not used to hearing in this formal setting, but you've experienced this type of development. There are a number of, main streets and cities and towns all across America were built with these sorts of buildings in this way in the past. And so again, to bring it back home, you have some guesses about what type of building type that, if the cannery were rebuilt today or were given a building type classification, what building type, from the slide above, would you classify this as?
Storefront.
Storefront? That's correct. It would qualify as a storefront building. And my point in just going through that little exercise is that this is something that it's intuitive once you get the main idea, that there's a common sense and a reason to this. that, you know, people have experienced these before. We all have experienced them in one part of our life or another. So the next principle that's common to form-based code is open space, and it's about proximity, or in other words, being near the neighborhoods and located inside the neighborhoods, and also the type of neighborhood or the context that they're in. Open space needs to be located within each neighborhood within a certain distance of the buildings. The point here is that, going back to talking about a walkable neighborhood, one of the core principles of the development pattern is that you should have most or all of your needs met within a 5 to 10 minute walk in this sort of development, your ability to meet that within 5 to 10 minutes of walk. And so open space is considered a key area. If you think about a lot of the events in history and in our country's history, they have occurred in public spaces. And if those public spaces weren't within a certain proximity, those events would not have been as easily facilitated, right? And so it's embedding this open space in the neighborhood within a certain distance of the of most homes in the neighborhood, so that people have, you know, essentially the ability to get to open space that they can enjoy within a certain amount of time, and then in this open space that meets the character of the neighborhood that it's built within. Let's see. And so going back to the concept of the two different types of development, of urban and suburban, there's more urban types of open space. We're all familiar with the plaza. There's a number of plazas that you can probably think of off the top of your head that come to mind. And so this is an example of a plaza. The plaza, each of the open space types need to meet certain characteristics. So the plaza, for instance, has to have at least 40% of it has to be, of the square footage of it needs to be hardscape. Meaning, and it has to have two different types of hardscape, like bricks, brick pavers, and concrete. It can't just have one or the other. And so what that does is it creates a certain character for that open space. And the form-based code serves as a matrix of possibilities where, you know, if you want to do the downtown Main Street, then you can do these types of buildings at this number of stories, and those match with this type of open space. Say the plaza or the square would go in downtown Main Street, but the Commons is going to go in a downtown neighborhood. It doesn't really fit as a place that would go, say, on Washington Boulevard. It would, however, fit, you know, in the back of a series of townhomes where, you know, their kids can have some open space and the kids can come out and play in that area. It's a little bit more private. It's also smaller. There are also different acreage requirements, minimums and maximums for these that also determine, you know, help make them fit or not fit in the different sub-districts. And so the point is you're aligning character all along the scale. You've got building, you got your elements of the code, which are your streets, your blocks, your building types, and your open space. And there's probably a few other I'm missing, but the point is you give developers choice within a certain range so that they can help give variety and attract things to their particular development, but that also you limit the choices to those that have the character that match the other components in that neighborhood, that have the same basic character for that, so that you have a neighborhood that works and feels like it fits together. Instead of trying to put like a bicycle tire on an automobile, right? You want to make sure you get the right parts that work together. And so that's what the form-based code does, is it's a grid or a table of these different parts, and it says you have these 3 options for open space, you have these 4 options for building types, you can put this in this sub-district and it will work together. It allows the city to know up front, okay, these are our ranges of what the possibilities are, we're comfortable with these ranges, we feel comfortable that these mix well together. We've left these 2 building types out because we don't feel like those mix well together. But the developer then can have still some flexibility, so he's more likely to be able to make a project pencil and work for him or her to make some, you know, to make sure that they are profitable on the project. And so the goal is to create a win-win for the city and the developer by allowing certainty for the city and flexibility for the developer within a certain range. So there are additional sections in the form-based code that I've left out. There's landscaping, parking, uses, and administration. The reason why I left these out is because I wanted to make sure we're focused on the big idea of the code, the end goal type of development that we're trying to achieve in this code, so that when you read through the code, that you understand why is this requirement in here? What in the world is it doing? Well, my hope is that this presentation helps answer that for you. And what I would suggest and recommend is that as you read through the code, have a copy, either digital or physical, of this presentation with you, and as you read through the code, look at the diagrams, look at the pictures, and see how the requirements are helping to create the type of environment that is described in this PowerPoint with the photos and the diagrams, so that you are able to understand the purpose behind those requirements instead of just wondering if they're just, detail on end without a purpose, right? And so the code has a lot of detail. I think that's probably something that's clear from what I'm saying. And I'm trying to describe in this PowerPoint the purpose of that detail, what the end goal it's trying to get as a result of that detail, the type of development and the character development it produces. Couple of additional thoughts. Because the code has a lot of detail, these sort of applications would require more time for staff to review. And staff, we just want to make you aware of that up front so that you're aware of it, and to mention that we need your support, what we've put into the code. The main thing that I'm really getting down to is that we'd need probably a longer period of time to review these prior to going to Planning Commission than the typical projects, because they do require more review of the stories, the details, the materials, it's things like this. But the goal is that you get a high quality product, and it's not a value judgment. It's not saying that this is better than other patterns of development in North Ogden. But when everyone knows, like, say you're good friends with somebody and you think you're good friends, and then maybe you go on a camping trip, right? And you have to share a tent together. Well, the closer you get together, the more rules you have to start to figure out, the more sensitivity you start to have, more intelligence you have to have about paying attention to what's getting on your tent mate's nerves or whatever. And so that's why the detail exists in the form-based code, is it's saying, okay, we'd like to see if we can mix stuff together. We think it's actually possible, but we just have to put a few conditions in place to make sure that we don't end up at the end of our 3-day camping trip not very happy neighbors with one another. And so that's the purpose for the detail in the code, and that requires more time on the part of staff to review. And then the final thing is that there's certain lessons that can and will only be learned by reviewing. Actually, if the code is adopted, by actually reviewing the applications in the code. I've been through this code several times and edited it from the draft that we got from our consultant. But there's certain things that aren't going to fall into place until we actually review the code. We've tried to, we've done a lot of work to foresee as many of those as possible. But it's just, it's the nature of the beast when you're switching from reviewing one type of development to another. There's things that you're only going to realize from the experience of reviewing an actual application. And so we wanted to make you aware of that as well. But I will say that we've done our best to think of all the foreseeable possibilities and issues that could come up. And then finally, I just want to close with going back to this and looking at these images in this diagram. So, and my hope is that you see different things in these images than you did at the beginning of the presentation. Instead of seeing, oh, that's a really pretty building, looks good, that's great. Hopefully what you're now seeing is the fact that the building is next to the sidewalk. It has a story limit of probably 3.5 stories. There's a roof line here that requires that you probably can't go above that number of stories. And then you'll see what here is probably a secondary street here. You have an internal street here on this block. You have a mix of housing types that have been decided that they play well together. These are townhomes and these are single-family homes. They're on the same block, but they face similar homes across the street. So they, in the front where it's, being pretty is more of a concern. They're the same, but in the back they're different, where they think it's more compatible to switch. Again, you'll see these are probably a slightly different density or intensity of single-family home than these are. And so there's a number of principles in here. And then the main place where I think you can pick up a lot of information is, again, this diagram. Before it was hopefully, cute image, some nice bright colors. But here now we have a primary street, we have the building, that's right next to the street and right next to the sidewalk. The parking's in the back. The parking is not accessed here. It's accessed off of a secondary street, not a primary street. And that, you'll see again this image that the change in the building type occurs on the same block, but not across the main street from one another. They're the same here, but they're different at the back side is where it changes of the block. This half of the block's different than that half, but not where they face each other on a street. So the people are looking at the same building on the front of the street. Across the street is the same building type as theirs. Again, you'll see maximum block size here. Again, you have primary, secondary, internal streets here. Then you have your 5 to 10 minute walk circle right here. You have open space located within several points within that 5 to 10 minute walk. This is a civic building. We had that picture earlier that showed the civic building behind the open space. And so you'll see that my hope is that this image and diagrams come alive to show all these principles. So you can understand when you look at these images that this is the end goal of the code, that all the regulations, what it produces. So I think I know that's a lot of information I've shared with you. Go ahead.
I was going to say, Brandon, one thing I think, I'm going to go back to one of your earlier slides. And some of the council I think is well aware of this, but I want to just make sure it's really clear. So this is an actual map of the city, and this is the area we're talking about. So Brandon, will you help them kind of understand that we're not talking about using this across the entire city? It's more focused on the downtown district.
Yeah, thanks. Appreciate that insight. So the point of the form-based code would be to apply specifically to the downtown area, being, I guess you could say, subdivided into the main street, which Washington Boulevard would serve as if the code is adopted, and then the neighborhoods behind it that support it. You need a certain amount of intensity of development in order to make to make the main street area viable as a walkable environment. And so you need supporting neighborhoods behind it. And so the areas that are specified here, the pink is the walkable, or sorry, the pink is the downtown, I'm slipping my mind right now, downtown market subdistrict. The purple is the downtown Main Street subdistrict, and the orange is the downtown neighborhood subdistrict. And so this map proposes that you'll see there's different street types that would be required to be added as the development in that area as those blocks were redeveloped. And so you'd say, okay, you want to develop that's great, go ahead. You have to put in a secondary street here, an internal street here, but you still get some choice. You might be able to put in an alley or a lane, a lane so that it can meet the requirements for your development. And so, again, as John pointed out, these areas that have a specific color, they would the form-based code would specifically be limited to those areas unless at a later point the city decided it wanted to add some more of this type of development in a different area or expand the area. But we wouldn't be allowing this, carte blanche everywhere in the city. It would be specifically for the purpose of creating a walkable downtown and walkable neighborhoods that support it. So I guess I'd like to open it up to questions, and I think maybe the best way to do it, because I want to make sure that I want to prep you as well for the opportunity to read the code as best I can. So lay it on me. What is it there from this that you don't understand, that's not making sense? Is there something that I'm, that I'm not communicating clearly so that we can eliminate that roadblock and make sure that you know what the type of development that the code is producing? Is there something I've left, muddy as, clear as muddy water?
Brandon, I think you covered it very well. My question is, was it 2 years ago, we had a presentation on similar, that was the starting of this, correct? Mm-hmm. And that was kind of at the same time we were talking about the development on 1700 and trying to incorporate, that coming north, correct?
Yeah.
So, and so would you suggest that, as we read it, you suggested that having this presentation while we read through it the one 2 years ago, should we have kind of look at that too, or should that, we scrap that idea and just kind of go with this?
The presentation on 1700 North?
No,
Or-
presentation you did on the form-based code a
I
couple
think
years ago.
whichever one helps you understand the development. This is an overview enough, and I believe that one was as well, enough that that either would be helpful to you. If you find the other one helpful, go ahead and use that one. The one reason why I think this may be a little bit more helpful is because I've tried to use a lot of photos in here and a lot of diagrams that get at the fundamental character of the development. Then that one, I don't think I focused quite as much on describing the character of the development, because every slide in here basically deals with one of the fundamental requirements of the code that there's like a whole section on. And so this is tied in great detail to the code. So I think this would, if you choose one, I'd choose this, but there's no disadvantage to going through it with the other presentation as well.
Okay, and then one other thing on the actual code, which there's 140 pages. The colors, there's different colors that you use different colors in the font. Was that because you changed things, or is that just stuff you want to highlight? Or
Yeah, that's a great question. There were 3 colors that I used where the text was changed, and the purpose of those colors was the orange and red were for like, I really want to bring this to the Planning Commission's attention and make sure they're comfortable with it. The blue was, we're making a change here. We think it's relatively benign. We don't think it's gonna be a problem, but we also want to highlight the fact that this technically changed. It may have just been a clarification or something like that. And so anything in the color text is something that was changed from, this was adapted from a template. Anything in the color text is something that's been changed from the template. And the orange and the red are ones that were adaptations that we felt in, that issue, maybe we didn't necessarily, how to say this, it's not the only solution, but it's a solution that has a range of possibilities, and we want to bring it to the Planning Commission so they could be informed on it and decide if they wanted to go with a different solution on that particular issue.
so in a month you want us to, we gave the homework assignment then, right?
I think that's a fair way of putting it, if that's okay with you.
You want us to all write a book report on it?
Yeah, if you want me to grade it, I'll grade it too. So.
Copy yours.
Thank you, Brandon. I think you did a great job. It's, I think it's, the development's a great idea. They do it all over the state. In fact, I can't think of the area. It's on 2100 South in Salt Lake, kind of east area. They got it all over there.
Yeah.
It's, personally, drives me crazy if you want to go there to eat, because the parking is terrible.
In Sugar House?
Yeah, Sugar House. That's
Yeah.
where it's at. It's
Okay, so
terrible.
so Sugar House is
They want
a
you to
great
walk
example.
there.
Another local examples of tie
Well, it sucks when you gotta walk.
to is Station Park is kind of what I describe as a downtown without a town. It's a downtown type of environment people love to go to. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that, but the point is it helps you visualize, this is a place in our area where this would be sort of a Main Street or downtown type of environment. And then the closest example that's actually pretty high quality, and there were some photos of it in here, is on 21st or 20th in Ogden, just a couple blocks of the LDS Temple.
Kind of behind Slackwater Pizza.
Yeah, and America First, there's a bunch of townhomes. Again, you'll notice, so what I really hope is that you'll read the code and have a picture in your mind of, okay, sidewalk, 5-10 foot setback, or maybe 0 foot setback, townhome, parking in the back, right? Those photos, they're more than pretty, they're very information rich, and I'm hoping that you can connect the photos to the regulations so that you can see, okay, this is why we actually have the regulation. They're not just endless regulations for the sake of regulation, or because planners like to hear themselves talk, which you could still argue that they do.
And if you go to Slackwater Pizza, you gotta get the heart attack pizza. It's all meat. It's awesome.
Is there
Way
anything
awesome.
else that's not making sense that I can clarify for you to make this more digestible?
I think after our homework, we'll have more questions.
All right. So, and one final point is that maybe my point at the beginning will make more sense about there's certain choices that are not compatible with the code, and there's certain choices that aren't. One of those examples is if you try and create this type of development and then say, okay, but we're gonna put the parking lot in the front in between the sidewalk, you can start to see how it fundamentally erodes this type of development. Again, it's not a value judgment, it's just saying, time-tested, proven, these, you know, walkable, urban and drivable suburban, they work well as on their own, but trying to mix and turn into a hybrid doesn't work so well. And so the question is not saying is one better than the other, it's just saying, is this what you want for your downtown? And if so, then this is a range of choices that are compatible that we can discuss. If you want to make these choices, you might want to reevaluate whether you actually want to adopt the code or not, because it will eat at the fundamental nature of the code, and it would also take a lot of work to try and write a code that worked against itself in that way. So, all right. I hope that I haven't just inundated you with a waterfall of information there. So thanks for your time.
Great job,
Thank you.
Great job.
Very nice. So do you want to talk about the streetscape now, or do you?
Oh,
want
yeah,
to get
sorry.
into that?
Kai, do you want to come talk about it? Kai has a couple of things that are related to the form-based code he wanted to share. I'll be brief, I promise.
And so Kai is our planning intern. He's been working with Brandon and Rob to do special projects, and the streetscape for Washington is one of those.
Zoom that, or bring that all the way in, so we can see the entire map.
Try. It's just how it is in the presentation.
All right, well, you can see it on that screen. This is kind of basically the existing conditions along Washington Boulevard. This is specifically 1700 North, right as you come into town. Okay, next.
Oh, sorry, it's not wanting to work.
So this well, what we're looking, this is just basically showing the current sidewalks and the trees. This is
Fill in it. You can't-
at 1700 North, existing conditions. You can see still undeveloped, kind of. Oh, all right, perfect. Okay. This area is currently being developed. And that's why we chose this block, is because if the form-based code is adopted, this is where you'll see the impact the most. Next slide, please. And this is a drawing of the streets with all of the elements of the form-based codes, complete and complete streets. You notice the buildings are next to the walkway. There's added street trees spaced at approximately 25 feet apart. There's a center median, bike lanes, on-street parking, and you can't see it here, but there's actually what's called bulb outs have been added to the street, which adds an element of traffic calming and visibility to drivers, to the pedestrians, it increases street safety. We're working on this block by block with 4 different renditions with the different elements: on-street parking, no parking, no bike lanes, and that's just very brief where we're at. It maybe helps visualize kind of what Brandon was talking about.
So is UDOT involved in these at all, since that's Washington, is that, it's UDOT street?
Not currently. We haven't approached them about any changes yet.
On that topic, UDOT has told us that if you're to go in the policy direction of adopting the form-based code, we will need to look at Washington Boulevard. You're going to need a street that's compatible with the buildings around it. And UDOT's policy is that if we have something formally adopted in a complete streets policy or policy, and then they are, have more responsibility to be sensitive to and address that. We don't currently have a complete streets policy adopted. It's sort of the project that comes after the form-based code that would address Washington Boulevard. And if we were to adopt that, it's kind of part and parcel with the form-based code. If we were to adopt that, then they'd need to have more conversation with us about, because the city would have actually set a policy direction for the road. So.
Thanks, Brandon. Any other questions?
Let me give you an example of, we've been working with various site plans along Washington, and as a result of the variations that we have in the width of the park strip, widths of sidewalks, etc., one of the things that we addressed here not too long ago was the idea of having the cherry trees be the tree of choice along Washington. Well, part of this whole idea behind bringing buildings to the front, having wider sidewalks and what have you, that's really a key element as far as the design. So as the city installs the street furniture, the bus stops, the street lights, etc., it becomes really critical as part of having that vision incorporated into our own standards. So there's going to be some things that are going to be coming fairly quickly that will address some of that.
Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you for your time.
Thanks, Kai.
When hearing this, I was thinking of a trip I took to Germany. I think the name of the town was Rotenburg. And you drove to the outskirts and walked into the city. And those buildings were in the 1600s, so maybe we're behind. Okay, next item on the agenda is North Ogden, discussion on North Ogden's current home day care standards. Presenter will be Rob Scott, our planning director.
Thanks, Mayor and council members. I've taken the opportunity to do a little research relative to this question of daycare standards, and I've given you some information with respect to the state requirements as well as our own local requirements regarding daycares. So in the memo, I'll start out by just describing daycare is something that is regulated in state code. I've given you the code site for that, and I've underlined a particular piece in that, which is local governments have authority to impose their own capacity standards, namely the setting the number of children per license. And then I've given you a website if you're interested in looking at that as well. There are two types of child care licenses, center-based and home-based licenses. The center-based care is found in non-residential settings, so basically in commercial. Home-based is located in residential homes, and there are two types of home-based centers. The first one is called Licensed Family Child Care and Residential Certificate. So in essence, what's happened is that the state has identified and given the authority to the Department of Health to establish these regulations, and I've given you a summary of that as an attachment. So the residential certificate is limited to a maximum of 1 to 8 children, including the providers and caregivers' own children under age 4. The licensed family child care facility may have from 1 to 16 children, including the caregiver's own children under 4. And then when you start looking through the table, there's an awful lot more to that as well. So in terms of our own regulations, the North Ogden zoning regulations provide for the following. We have both permitted and conditional uses. The permitted uses go from up to 9 people in the daycare center. The operator must be a resident of the home. Home daycare shall not be greater than 300 square feet or 25% of the home, whichever is less. And the daycare area of the home shall conform to the standards of the building code. In terms of conditional uses, home daycare centers are in the operator's residence for more than 9 people, but not more than 12, plus supervisory personnel. Now, we have interpreted that to mean if they have additional people working there, they still have to be a resident of the home. An annual review by the Planning Commission is required. I don't believe we have any currently, and the Planning Commission is basically saying that should be a staff function in any case. The home daycare area, shall be not greater than 300 square feet or 25% of the house, whichever is less, and it also has to meet the daycare standards. There's also another provision in the ordinance. Chapter 10 is the one that relates to standards that apply to all zones. So in that particular subsection that talks about the regulations have to be, the licensing of daycare centers should be in accordance again with 26-39. There shall be outdoor play areas and fencing. All outdoor play areas shall be within a fenced area and shall be limited to use by the children of the daycare between the hours of 8 and 8 p.m. Fence height shall be in accordance with our code, fencing code. And then off-street parking, sufficient off-street parking shall be provided to satisfy the requirements. Now, we have anticipated that, and because we're not providing for parking other than basically drop-off, we have not required additional parking spaces on site relative to these facilities. So just by way of summary, what are the things that are included in our standards for daycare and residential areas? They address safety, site compatibility, and neighborhood issues and compatibility. So the first standard that talks about limiting the home to 25% of the home or 300 square feet, whichever is less, it basically is addressing the idea that the building should look like a home. It shouldn't be expanded to the point where it no longer resembles a home. Again, the centers are permitted, as I've already said, from 9 to 12 people, depending on whether it's permitted or conditional use. The operator must be a resident of the home. State regulations have to be complied with. State regulations actually give some additional flexibility, but when you get over 12, then it actually requires that there be 2 caregivers. So there would have to be more than 12. You would still have to meet that standard of having an additional supervisor. Neighborhood compatibility is also addressed by requiring fenced play areas and limiting the hours of operation. So this really is, like all legislative matters, these are policy matters. It's a policy issue. Just to give you a little bit of a comparison, we've had a lot of discussion in the last few years with respect to home occupations. Home occupations are also allowed in our residential zoned areas. And so we have a companion standard that relates to that. So the home occupation ordinance says that you're limited to 10 trips per day. Basically that amounts to 5 visits to a home per day. Trips in the world of traffic engineering relate to if one trip is getting to a place and the second trip is when you leave the place. So that's the way those are calculated. By allowing up to 12 people at a daycare center, that translates into approximately 24 trips a day. And each trip, both coming and going, counts as a trip. If there happens to be split sessions, then these numbers might double. And the city council will need to determine if this amount of added traffic in neighborhoods is acceptable. Basically, that's what we're talking about, is you're allowing for a commercial use in a residential neighborhood. What is the amount of intensity that you're willing to allow within those neighborhoods? In our general plan, we have some goals that relate to housing quality and the variety. We have identified for those for you again, establish and adhere to high quality building and design standards for all housing types so that the development enhances the community character. So that's part of the question is, what are the standards that will maintain that community character? It also talks about, from time to time, looking at standards and identifying whether or not those standards are appropriate, whether or not there should be some changes. So just by way of giving you some questions to think about, are safety codes addressed here? Are the neighborhood compatibility standards appropriate? What of allowed people is increased? Is the proposal consistent with the general plan? So by way of staff recommendation, this is a discussion, review the existing standards, determine if there should be an increase in the number of people allowed. If you decide that you're satisfied with the existing codes, then it doesn't need to go any further. If you desire some type of change, then this is a zoning matter and requires, and legislative matter requires that the Planning Commission review it and make a recommendation back to you. So that's quite a bit of information. Let me ask you if you have any questions. What would you like us to do as a staff?
Well, my question is, currently, it's 12, but the state will allow 16.
Under certain conditions,
Under certain
correct.
conditions, okay, so right now, even at 12, the trips, we're doing too many trips anyway.
Well, not necessarily, you allow 12
Okay,
anyway.
all right.
So that's, with a conditional use permit, you can allow up to 12.
Okay, and then this may sound like a silly question, but what is the difference between the daycare and a preschool? And the regulations there, or is there a difference?
Well, there is a difference, and basically, it's daycare is simply the care of an individual. Preschool, there's some sort of an educational component.
Right, but what is the numbers, do you know?
The preschool numbers actually go up to 14.
Okay.
On the preschool numbers, is it the same 300 square feet, or do they have a larger portion?
They have the same numbers, they have the same numbers. Our code does, and I did not research this, John may know, but the state code is not referenced in our zoning ordinance. I really don't even know if there is a preschool code section. We'll have to research that one. And if you'd like me to do some more research and bring it back to you
I
before
kind
you.
of caught you off guard asking that, so.
No, it's I think it's a pertinent question.
Councilman Swanson, did you have another question?
Yeah, if nobody else has anything they'd like to add first.
No, go ahead.
When you're researching the state code, will you also check on the square footage allowed? I'm thinking 300 square feet, that's pretty darn small.
It's just over 290.
Just under 301, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, see, I could have been a construction guy too, sort of. You know, 10 by 30 with 12 kids, 2 staff. And that's, I mean, if the reality is, I don't think that anybody limits it to 300 square feet. That might be the official declaration. But I can't imagine a dozen children, 2 adults, stuck. Well, I can, but then we'd be all over the news and our murder rate would go up.
So I think it's appropriate to look at it from the standpoint of up to 9 and then the additional 3 with a conditional use permit.
Right. Well, even 9 with an adult in a 30 by 10 area.
So again, it's the question of how much intensity do you want to introduce into residential neighborhoods? And so I don't know that there's a right or a wrong answer here, but that was obviously the standard that was established.
I'm just thinking of some of the homes that I have gone into in my business where there is a daycare being run in the basement, and you know, we're the ones that I'm thinking of off the top of my head over the last couple of months. There are 14, 15, 16 kids. You know, two of them have 2 adults and one has 3. You know, and they're using half their basement of a 1,900, 2,000 square foot footprint. So they're using, you know, 800, 900, maybe even 1,000 square feet between the play area and the snack area and those that still need to nap longer area and the timeout area, which is large in some of them. I'm just wondering if that 300 square feet is, it's just a question I have, if you could add that to your research and find out what other cities are doing, if they limit it to that size, just for discussion purposes.
Do the daycares, are they under, because I think a preschool has to be inspected, doesn't it?
I don't know the answer to that question.
Just in my head.
There are state licensing and inspection requirements
For preschool?
for any of those
Oh,
childcare.
For daycare, too?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Definitely for daycare, I did research that aspect of it.
Well, I'm personally, I'm not opposed to going up to the 16 as long as it's, you know, we follow all the rules. I'm not opposed to changing that. I just need to think through it a little bit, you know. Appreciate your research. That's my thought. I don't know if anybody else feels.
The real question, I think, is if you're open to the number, do you want it to go to the planning commission to start the process of amending the ordinance? Because if we come back again, then we're just delaying that longer.
I'm open to it, so.
Okay.
I don't know if anybody else is.
I am, yeah.
Yeah, I am too.
I can think of a couple of preschools here in North Ogden that have way more than 24 trips a day, from parents coming and dropping things off, and somebody soiled their pants and new ones have to be brought, you know, those kinds of things. So yeah. What's that? What was that, Cheryl?
So I guess that's done.
Some children go
So
through
I'm
more
just
than
wondering,
one set.
since we have that diversity in numbers in that, it might be appropriate just to include the preschool at the same time. See if we've got some
Yeah.
consistency with respect to that.
Sounds good.
Anything else, council?
Thanks, Robert.
Thanks.
Thanks, Robert.
Thank you, Rob.
Thank you very much.
Item 4, discussion on council policy and procedure. Presenter is John Call, City Administrator Attorney.
So, council, this is a carryover from our previous discussion about the rules and procedures the council has. Most importantly, this discussion deals with at least what we've talked about is the idea of agenda setting, you know, who has the authority to add things to the agenda and how that's done. What was been recommended is any council member can ask for that to happen and that they would contact Annette, who would put it on the agenda. There is a section in the ordinance that defines or says the order of items in the agenda. That's right here in Rule 6. And kind of it just says consent agenda, public comments, active agenda, public comments, council comments. It might be advisable to take this active agenda section and clarify that a little further. For example, well, a lot of cities, or let's just say the Planning Commission right now actually says anything that's a legislative item is going to be first, because those are the items that have public hearings and things like that on them. And then the other stuff would be second. So in our case, that might mean that contracts and things go towards the end of the agenda. The public hearing items go at the front of the agenda. One other possible consideration is staff items. When there's staff here, you know, on the clock, those might be also at the beginning of the agenda. Do you have any thoughts about how you'd like that organized? The other option is you could just always leave it to the discretion of the mayor to kind of set the order. But, you know, it just depends on what the council wants to do. Another item is our meeting schedule. Currently, the rules say we're supposed to meet every Tuesday and every second and fourth Tuesday of the month at 6:30. Obviously, lately we've been meeting every Tuesday at 6. So we should probably figure that out and put in the actual, put in what we're doing. The next item, as I was looking at, was it was Rule 7. This is something, in our current rules, it says that during public comments that they can ask questions. And I think that's a good idea, and then the mayor would decide who should respond to it. That's different than what we're putting on the current sheet. We've always, or sometimes we've said this isn't a question and answer back and forth. So it might be good to clarify how we want to address that from the council's perspective. And yeah, those are kind of the things that I felt like were kind of highlighted from our last discussion, as well as some things to just bring up for thought. What we're hoping is that after this discussion, anything the council wants to change, we can bring the language back at the next meeting and approve something if the council's ready to. Is there a direction you want to go in any of these items? Strong feelings one way or another?
I have some thoughts, but I don't need to go first.
You're the one that has thoughts, I don't.
I'm still formulating.
Cheryl?
I'm listening.
Okay. We have talked over the last week or two about the Tuesday night schedule that we've been doing, and that we would go back to consider going back to a work session the first Tuesday and then meet on the second and the fourth.
Right?
What's that?
As needed.
As needed, a work session, yeah. With meeting on the second and the fourth, I think that would answer, if we're in agreement with that, I think that would answer one of the questions that you have, John, about, we've been meeting at 6 for the last 4.5 years.
Sounds right.
Longer than that, because it was before I was actually appointed to be on council that the change was made to 6 o'clock. So it's been 5 years, probably 5 years plus, that the actual starting time has been 6 and not 6:30. So I would propose that we, as Councilwoman Stoker said, that we do work sessions as needed, and we meet on the second and the fourth Tuesdays. If there's more needed, we can always call an emergency meeting, right? Mm-hmm. We have the ability to do that if there's something that's that pressing.
The thing with this too, you'll get the work session and move off of the
Active agenda.
active agenda, move off some of those things that have nothing to do as far as any action is concerned. There are discussion items to talk about something that will come back later on as an action item on the second and fourth. So we won't be voting on anything on that work session.
Right. That's how we started out the work sessions, was that there was no active agenda at all on work session evenings. It was all discussion, no voting, no active agendas, except on a very rare occasion we've kind of drifted away from that. Not kind of, we have drifted away from it. We had also talked about in the last couple of weeks an ending time, to try to make ourselves be a little bit more efficient instead of having open-ended meetings that can go till Cheryl's favorite 12. What's the longest we've had? 12:40 in the morning? 12:40, 12:45? 6.5, 7 hour meetings. I would propose that we put an end time on our meetings, maybe 10:30.
No.
Okay. What would you suggest, Councilwoman Stoker? 9 o'clock? 9:30? 11?
No.
I was just throwing a number out. That's why I'm sitting far away. I don't want to get hit. What time would you think?
10 o'clock that's done.
I can support that.
9 o'clock would be perfect, but it gives you wiggle room to 10.
6 to 9.
6 to 9?
6 to 9.
With some wiggle room if there's a really important. Carl, what are you thinking?
6:30.
Yeah, you had a smirk on your face. I thought it might be something.
I'm indifferent. It's just, I don't enjoy long meetings, but we got to get it done, so I don't care. You guys decide. If it's midnight, it's midnight. If it's 10 o'clock, it's 10 o'clock. still gotta get up and go to work next day, so it doesn't matter.
Well, and with that, then we have to look at how we prioritize, Mayor, you prioritize what's on the agenda. You know, the most critical items first, public hearings, legislative items that we're making decisions on, new information discussion later maybe, so that we get done what needs to be done and we're not stuck at 5 minutes to 9 with 4 legislative items to pass or a public hearing to have and those kinds of things.
I think it'd be good to prioritize them to the front end of the agenda so that we can move them out of the way, and then if there's some other things that just need a discussion or something, they could be postponed for another meeting very easily, where maybe the legislative items could not.
Which then raises the question John asked of who sets the agenda, the order. I'm okay with the mayor.
I am too.
I don't
Okay.
see a need for me to
Being
be a
Annette.
part of it.
Doesn't the mayor and that do it anyway?
And that's the way we've been doing it, is
Yeah.
that the staff has been doing it. You know, we're trying to figure out where the most people are coming to and do those first.
You know, just, I mean, you know, you mentioned that, sort of, when you talked about how a council member asked for things to be put on the agenda, what if a resident wants to come in and do a presentation? Do they have to go to the council member to do that, or can they come to you?
That's the way we've been doing it lately. If it's
Coming to us? And then-
they come to a council member, then the council member will say, Annette, put it on. There have been a few exceptions where they've been city-sponsored things like the Miss North Ogden, or even like the Count My Vote. You know,
They were
we'd-
coming to the council anyway. They wanted to come and visit each one of you separately. And we suggested they come to a council meeting and just give you all the information at once.
and that went through the mayor. You know, so there again, a council member kind of made the final call that it be on the agenda. So it's always at least approved by the mayor, or you know.
Then my only other thought about the, you know, you brought up public comments and questions and things. I like the idea the mayor has discretion to respond to a comment or question, or even say, Blake, you can respond to this or something like that, you know. But I think, personally, I think public comments, there could be, I don't see a problem with it, some give and take. You know, they're asking questions and we answer what we know at the time. It even says in here, we may have to do some research to get the answer, but I actually kind of think like it to be a conversation, personally. You know, I mean, because there's sometimes I feel like that they ask a question and we all give them that dumb look of, well, we can't answer right now because it's a rule. I think it's good to have the mayor have some discretion to be able to, and that sounds like that's how it's written. Am I understanding that correctly?
Yeah.
And that's not how it's written at the bottom of the.
Right.
I haven't looked at the agenda lately, so is that how it's written at the bottom of the agenda, that they can't ask questions, or is it?
Well, what it says is,
Or on the back, either it's on the back or on?
yeah, so it does say, it's actually somewhere in line with what's already in there, but in practice, there's been times where, you know, the comment's been made, this isn't a back and forth. And so I think that's the fine line you're walking, is if it's a back and forth discussion, then there's the chance for it to turn into an argument of some sort, which is fine.
We've never argued.
Or there might be some chances to say, okay, we're gonna make it really clear, ask all your questions, and then at the end someone will respond, or whatever the council wants to do. You can pick anything you want. It's just a matter of, even if it's just enough to remind ourselves, this is the rule that we have and this is the rule we're following, so that we're not giving a mixed message. Because I think sometimes it's been mixed. We're not going to respond to questions when, you know, our rules allow us to. So.
And I'll be honest, that's kind of how I always thought, that we don't respond unless the mayor says, yeah, you can respond, so.
As I was reading through this, it was very clear that a response to questions is permissible. I think one of the things we have to be cognizant of, though, as we're trying to be more efficient, is we need to be better at sticking to the 5-minute limit. You know, sometimes a public comment from an individual can go 20, 25 minutes from one individual without a question being asked and no response being given, just going on and on and on for 20 minutes. I think we need to, I mean, I've mentioned before, I know Cheryl, you don't like it, but I think a timer is appropriate so that we know and the individual asking questions or making the comment knows how much time they have. I mean, when I've gone to state meetings, when I've gone to county meetings, there's always a timer that tells you how much time you have. And if there's questions entertained, it's within that time limit. And I think that will help us to stay on schedule a little bit more. And also help the answering of questions not become a debate or an argument. If there's a, does that make sense?
Yeah, I'm with Cheryl on that. I don't necessarily like a timer.
Okay.
It's pretty tacky.
But that's, you know, I mean, that's just Cheryl and I. Blake and Ryan, you may have different opinions. You can speak for Ryan too, he's not here. So.
Well, I think it would facilitate, you know, working through the discussion better and quicker and more efficiently. Trap door.
You have a trap door? Is that what you're tapping on down there? I'm gonna pull the
No, I
linch
probably
pin.
got myself through it.
John, something else that I noticed in looking through this in the order of business in Rule 6.
Yeah.
That we have a welcome and then a moment of reflection. I think we should, and you had mentioned that somewhere else also that it said that a city official had to be the one to do the pledge or the moment of reflection. I think a resident ought to be able to do that if they would like to. They can, I mean, we've talked about this before, call the city and say, I know on the fire board, the Northview Fire Board, we have it's a prayer / thought / whatever, you know, inspirational quote or whatever. And last time I chose to give a quote instead of a prayer. And I think we ought to have that option here that anyone who would like to be a part of opening our meetings isn't obligated to necessarily give a prayer, although they certainly could of whatever faith and style that is theirs. But if somebody who was non-religious wanted to open it up with a patriotic quote or you know, something that's inspiring, I wouldn't be an objection to that. I think it would make our meetings more inclusive.
And so that's what this actually says, that moment of reflection may consist of a prayer, quote, thought, etc. But it is of the elected officials choosing. So right now it's written mayor and council members.
We used to have,
But we've
invite others to come, like
we've
other
invited lots
faiths
of
and
other
that to
people.
come and.
Yeah.
And
And-
So I think we
scouts
need
and-
to do that again.
Okay.
We used to have some of the
So,
surrounding churches.
so maybe we should add mayor and council members or other person as invited,
Invites,
or, and there again, I mean, the way, you know, I hate to put Annette in a position where someone's coming to her and saying, hey, I want to be on the agenda. Is it better for them to route it through the mayor or through a council member?
The mayor or the council.
And then the other thing that's come up, it hasn't come up in our city before, but some cities have dealt with where several people want to give, for lack of a better word, competing moments of reflection. There's YouTube videos, you know,
I've seen them.
where people who are non-religious will make a statement, and then someone who is religious would like to follow up with a
I
prayer.
think we limit it to one individual, and whatever they choose to do is what they choose to do.
Okay.
As long as it's not intentionally
So would the
controversial.
agenda need to say where it says welcome Mayor Chug, invocation and pledge allegiance instead of the invocation, but moment of reflection and pledge allegiance?
Or invocation,
We
Yeah.
just go-
or whatever, yeah.
It
it
says
We
can
do
be-
that,
reflection.
moment of
yeah,
reflection.
That's what it says in there.
Okay.
Could be a moment of silence, I mean, if somebody wanted that, whatever.
So you're
Could you
gonna,
do that,
you're gonna
Phil?
change it to what?
So instead of
I know.
so let me go back to the agenda so you can see it. So instead of here, invocation and pledge, it would say moment of reflection and pledge of allegiance. And it could be two separate, the moment
I
of.
think you should take prayer out of it, moment of inflection, prayer, or pledge. And moment, inflection, whatever you said.
Invocation, yeah.
Or prayer and pledge.
Okay. So I could just grab this same language, or we could just say, it's a prayer, quote, thought by this person, and then pledge of allegiance.
No, I just think you should, prayer is self-defining. Prayers come in different forms,
Yeah, we have invocation on there now, not prayer.
They read, whatever, yeah, that works too.
Okay.
Okay, well,
Okay. So I'll get some language
okay.
and propose some different things. I mean,
Okay.
if you want to open it so it isn't just an invocation, then I think something other than, so like invocation or moment of reflection, would that work?
Sure.
Okay.
We always do and or
Okay.
whereas, or therefore.
And do you want to establish if someone, council member or do you want to worry about a timeline? I mean, we haven't had a problem with it.
Timeline on what?
A time restriction. So maybe for moment of reflection, someone wanted to read a 80 stanza poem or the Bill of Rights, or that's the question is, do you want to worry about it if it's, because it hasn't been a problem before?
I think, well, you're still going to have it by, it says here, of the elected officials choosing, and they still need to come to the city council member or mayor, right?
Mm-hmm.
And if they come to me or us, we could say, well, what is your moment of reflection? Because we don't want it to be too long, and then we could, you know what I mean?
And appropriate.
Yeah.
I think they're again saying how long is your moment of reflection?
Yeah, that's what we
Yeah.
would say, and then we could, if they want to read War and Peace, we'd tell them no, but if they want to read one little quote.
Mhm.
It has to be in the deadline.
And yeah, so we'd need that person's name enough time ahead so that it can be on the regular agenda. I mean, I think where we've had scouts step in for whoever was there to do the Pledge of Allegiance, it's been fine. So. Okay, so we will expand this language to include or invitee, whoever's invited to. Okay. Anything else that were in these rules? There's a lot of them that can't be changed. Like we can't change what the definition of a quorum is. In fact, if I was going to change it, I would just eliminate the whole section and say whatever state code says, because the state code trumps our policies and procedures. There is a section in here that allows for council members to participate electronically, which some have taken advantage of in the past. I think that's a good thing. It allows you to vote even when you're gone.
Well, when I read through it, maybe I just missed it, it said that before I thought it was electronically, they couldn't participate in a closed meeting. But is that, I didn't see that in there, or maybe I just missed it?
So, let's see.
That's how we've
That's
done it.
how we've done
I
it.
just didn't
Yeah.
see it in there, but maybe I just missed it. Maybe it could be under the closed meeting rule too, I don't know.
There should be, sorry, I'm just trying to make
It's under Rule 3, Section 5, closed meetings.
Is it under there?
Well, I would think that's where it would be. I don't see it in here.
It doesn't say it in that section, closed meetings.
Well, it talks about let me see what section it is.
Yeah.
Form requirements, voting in electronic meetings, section 4. If you go down to 15, even 14, it talks, but I just didn't see where it talked about C. 16 talks about it. Oh wait, number 17 does, it says that participate by council member electronically at a closed meeting is prohibited, so it does cover that. Okay. I missed it until now. Thanks.
So is there any other tweaks, I mean, in all of these that we need to make? I know.
Last thing I have is, as individuals are contacting us, wanting to be a portion of the invocation, the recital or whatever it is, I would guess, and